Deep in the jungles of the Philippines, an Australian soldier lays on a makeshift stretcher made out of bamboo and leaves. Using a mirror, a pocket knife, and no anesthesia whatsoever, the man starts making a small incision in his abdomen. Biting down on a wooden stick to avoid screaming out in pain, the soldier proceeds with the ad hoc surgery, using his fingers to feel for his enlarged appendix. In the distance, there's the sound of gunfire as Japanese troops hunt down the Filipino guerrillas sheltering the Australian. Time is running out, and soon the guerrillas will have to move to a new location, whether the Australian man is ready to go or not. And that's if he even survives this self-surgery in the middle of a disease-ridden jungle. Born in Scotland in 1902, Robert Kerr McLaren emigrated to Australia in his teens after serving briefly in the First World War. The land down under soon became his adopted home, and there McLaren learned how to be a veterinarian. Eventually, he would work as a vet surgeon in Bundaberg, Queensland, unknowingly learning critical skills that would one day save his own life and that of dozens of other men. At 36 years old, he met his wife-to-be, Catherine Ahern, and married her on June 18, 1938. With World War II heating up, though, Britain would call on its colonies and commonwealths to help defend her. The Japanese were rampaging across the Pacific and blockading or outright destroying British forces all over her many colonies in the South Pacific. On the 12th of March 1941, McLaren joined the Citizen Military Forces, learning basic infantry skills, transferring 1 month later to the Australian Imperial Force. War wouldn't call for him, though, until January the next year, when he was dispatched to Singapore, attached to the 2nd 10th Ordnance Field Workshops. Unfortunately for McLaren, the British Commonwealth forces were quickly overrun by the superior armed Japanese, and McLaren, along with hundreds of fellow soldiers, were imprisoned in a POW camp in Singapore. Not particularly keen on Japanese hostility, McLaren decided to escape along with 2 fellow Aussies, and the men joined up with a band of Malaysian guerrillas fighting against the Japanese. It was with these guerrillas that McLaren would start to hone the deadly hit-and-run techniques he would later employ to devastating effect against the Japanese. But for now, he and the men with him were betrayed by one of the other guerrillas and delivered straight into Japanese hands. The Japanese recognized McLaren and the other 2 Australians as escapees and made them face firing squads for 6 successive mornings, only to have the execution order stayed each time. Instead, the men were put on a transport and shipped to Pudu Jail in Kuala Lumpur, though a few months later they were sent back to the POW camp in Changi that they were originally held at. McLaren, along with 500 other Australians and 500 British soldiers, were eventually transferred to a more secure facility in Borneo in March of 1943, which had formerly been a British colony. At the new facility, McLaren and a Chinese prisoner made contact with the local Filipino guerrillas, who were quick to aid the 2 and several other men escape from the prison camp. Along with another Australian who had escaped weeks before, the small group decided that their best chance was to get to the American-held Philippines and from there rejoin an Australian unit. Thus, the men made their way to the coast. But with no boats at hand, they knew they'd have to build their own. Using machetes, the men made crude hollowed-out canoes from fallen tree trunks and then incredibly set sail across nearly 270 miles of Pacific Ocean. The men stuck close to the coastlines when possible, but were on constant alert for patrolling Japanese vessels, which they knew they had no hope of outrunning in their crude little canoes. Along the way, the men stopped at different islands, routinely raiding small Japanese units for supplies. In a small theater production of what would later become the American island-hopping campaign against Japan, McLaren and the men with him would hit one small island after the other, killing or forcing the Japanese there to flee and raiding their stashes of food, medicine, and ammunition. Unfortunately, word spread a lot slower back then than it does today, and especially when you've spent most of the last year and a half in a prison camp. When McLaren and the other men landed in the Philippines, they discovered that the Japanese had already forced the surrender of all American forces on the islands. With no hope of being returned to an Australian unit or of being rescued, McLaren and the others decided that they'd go ahead and just keep on fighting World War II on their own. McLaren soon made contact with a group of American soldiers who had decided that surrender simply didn't suit them very well and had taken to leading a guerrilla force made up of Americans and Filipino soldiers and volunteers. By now, a seasoned guerrilla fighter, McLaren partook in a deadly campaign against the Japanese occupation force, destroying supply convoys, raiding Japanese depots, and generally making life hell for the Imperial Japanese Army. For their part, the Japanese brutally persecuted the Filipino population, hoping to discourage any cooperating with guerrillas by terrorizing the villagers spread out across the islands and threatening death to any sympathizers. At this point, though, McLaren was struck down with appendicitis, a particularly troubling condition given the fact that there were no local hospitals he could hope to check himself in. If left untreated, his appendix would eventually burst and, without a doubt, kill him. A trained veterinarian, though, McLaren knew what he had to do, and given that none of the other men with him had any medical training whatsoever, the procedure would be left completely up to him. McLaren took stock of his situation. He had few, if any, medical supplies available to him, and no actual surgical tools. Anesthetic, even if he had access to any, was out of the question as he would be his own chief surgeon. What he did have available to him was a sharpened pocket knife, boiled river water, tough, stringy plant fibers he could use as suitable sutures, a small handheld mirror, and half a bottle of rum for the pain, which he passed on as he'd have to be completely sober for his own procedure. With the Japanese actively hunting McLaren and the combined American, Australian, and Filipino force down, McLaren began his self-surgery. He would have to not just endure the terrible pain of cutting into his own flesh, but successfully cut the appendix loose and then quickly clamp vital blood vessels down to avoid bleeding to death. Over the course of 4 hours, McLaren took to his body with the small pocket knife, fighting against the pain to dig into his abdomen and cut free the inflamed appendix. Then, using a sharp needle and plant fibers, he stitched his own wound closed. 4 days later, McLaren was on his feet again, and after an additional week of rest, he was back once more to the deadly business of making the Japanese regret their part in World War II. In September of that year, McLaren decided that being a jungle-fighting, guerrilla-fighting badass was good and well, but the supply of land-bound Japanese was starting to run thin, due in large part to America's vengeful counterattack against the Japanese all across the Pacific. The sea, though, was full of Japanese soldiers to kill, and thus McLaren took command of a small whaling ship and retrofitted it with cannons and any piece of firepower that could be nailed down. The makeshift war vessel began to prowl the waters off the island of Mindanao, and McLaren now began his career as a pirate. Renowned for his bold and aggressive nature in the face of the enemy, McLaren and his makeshift warboat, appropriately named the Bastard, attacked many smaller Japanese vessels, sending quite a few to the briny deep. Always the opportunist, though, McLaren would also target Japanese coastal installations, bombarding them with cannon fire and retreating to the high seas before Japanese planes had a chance to respond. Occasionally, though, McLaren would lead combat patrols on land, and on one such occasion he led part of a larger assault on a Japanese stronghold in Lanao province. The garrison was completely destroyed, and American Lieutenant Colonel Charles W. Hedges reported that McLaren's actions ensured the capture of the garrison and the destruction of roughly 450 Japanese troops. By now, though, the American Navy was making the Japanese fleet a rapidly diminishing resource, and having decided that they'd let McLaren run amok like a pirate warlord for long enough, the Australian military ordered him to join with the American and Australian intelligence agents and parachute behind enemy lines in Borneo. Leading one of several other four-man teams, McLaren and his men undertook a risky nighttime parachute drop behind enemy lines, only to have one of his men captured in an ambush by a Japanese patrol. Another man was injured on landing, and perhaps worst of all, the Japanese managed to find and capture the team's food, water, and radios. Down to 3 men, one of which was injured, and with no food or water or supplies and no radio, McLaren decided that all this made the odds just about even for the Japanese, and decided to go ahead with his mission regardless. Using 3 years of jungle warfare knowledge, he was able to secure food and water and recon the Japanese positions defending the island, all while avoiding aggressive Japanese patrols. Then, his mission complete but with no radio to report in with, McLaren simply slipped past enemy lines to deliver his critical report. The intelligence proved critical in the successful American landings against the Japanese, and American General MacArthur himself would award him the U.S. Silver Star, the 3rd highest American military decoration and rarely ever awarded to a non-American service member. By now, an end to World War II was in sight, but the stubborn Japanese refused to surrender. Given that at this point McLaren was one of the most experienced jungle and guerrilla fighters in the entire Allied command, he was tasked with leading an 8-man team on a reconnaissance mission of Japanese forces in Talasia, British North Borneo. Once more, his intelligence proved vital in the successful destruction of Japanese forces in the area and the capture of a major enemy garrison. McLaren would ultimately be awarded the Military Cross with an additional bar and the American Silver Star, all for gallantry and heroism in combat. A terror on both land and the high seas, it's probably a good thing that McLaren never learned to fly a plane, or he would have surely taken to making life hell for the Japanese in the air as well. After the war's end, McLaren refused to return home right away, instead remaining with his 8-man team in North Borneo and helping to see to the needs of civilians ravaged by war. Eventually, he returned home to Australia, though he would soon take a job as a government veterinary officer in Papua New Guinea. In 1956, he retired from public service and took over running a coffee plantation, though tragically there he would accidentally back his Jeep into a pergola and be killed when a falling log crushed him to death. One of Australia's finest soldiers though, McLaren's heroism and courage serves as an example even today, and a testament to the quality of men and women who defend their home in the land down under. Think you could have handled fighting alongside McLaren's guerrilla forces? What if you had to cut out your own appendix? Let us know in the comments, and as always, if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more great content.